Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Democratic Constitution podcast. We're here today with a special guest, Tad Stoermer. Tad, can you just briefly explain how you came to be a public historian?
I was radicalized into being a public historian at Colonial Williamsburg. I am trained as an academic historian out of University of Virginia, and an academic historian focusing on American history, the American founding, the Revolution. And my first job out of graduate school was working at Colonial Williamsburg as the historian, thinking that I could, in fact, as the ego of all academic historians are, that I can talk to anybody. And I realized that I couldn't. That was a whole new skill set I needed to learn, a whole new set of priorities, a whole new set of understanding where people are, how to engage with them, how to engage with them in ways that matter to them, and then appreciating the broader value of that, the broader civic value of that, and how that can help inform. That can also help inform scholarship. And so that's how I became a public historian. I became a public historian by listening to lots and lots of people who visited Colonial Williamsburg from 2010 to 2014 and were changed by history. Were changed by understanding history in authentic ways and seeing how it in fact applied to their lives, not just as mythologies, but how honest history could inform the way people saw themselves, the way they thought about themselves as Americans, the way it informed identity, and the way that informed their behavior. So I saw the power there was in doing that well. I also saw the power that was in doing it badly or in misusing it and in deploying it for, let's just say, more pernicious ends. How their behavior, their impressions, how their perceptions could be purposefully twisted and misinformed in order to influence action. And seeing both of those things made me want to lean into it.
Were there particular ways that you realized people weren't connecting with the more academic historian side of things, or how did you find yourself trying to connect with people?
I, there was a huge yawning gap between what academic historians, particularly academic historians of the American founding and Revolution, understood about the Revolution, the war, the Constitution, that made it nowhere near most people, and that there are this chasm of different interpretations, of differing interpretations, even mutually exclusive ones, between academic historians of the revolution and the way most people, most Americans, the public, understands the revolution. And bridging that gap was almost impossible. There's too much deconstruction of mythology that has to happen with most people before you get them to the point where they're understanding it in ways that academic history has been understanding it for 20, 30, 40 years. And so I understood that they're actually, they might be complementary paths, but what you have to do is that if you're engaging people where they are, you have to go back to where they're getting their information, and then you have to start from there. That what I learned was that I thought that it would be a great project to go ahead and bridge that gap, taking people to where, talking about academic scholarship and relating it to what most people know. It's too big a gap. And to do that requires too much. In fact, it's destabilizing to people. They don't know what the hell you're talking about. And so instead, it is much more effective to go to where people are, understand kind of where they're off about the authentic history, much less the scholarship, and then go back and try to not necessarily re-engineer that, but kind of deconstruct that and build it back up where they already are.
So you've put out a lot of work, and I at least was first introduced to your work through your blog posts. Your blog also includes a lot of book reviews, and then more recently your TikTok videos. You also have a new book coming out, which is a resistance history of the United States. And I thought we could start by diving into some of the themes of your body of work and start with the American Revolution, which is what you've been discussing. You have this idea of the real American Revolution, which sounds like is exactly what you're talking about, one that really connects with people. How do you describe that history? What is that history? The major events that people should be aware of leading up to the war for independence, perhaps this event that everyone really knows about. But what's behind that?
I just go where John Adams was. Right, when in the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, when a lot of people who don't know what the American founding was supposed to be, what July 4th, 1776 was all about, they started these generations that were one or two generations removed from the lived experience of that period and everything that went into it. They started reaching out to the surviving patriots, Adams and Jefferson and others, to try to get from them, well, what actually was this? We know we celebrate July 4th. We know kind of the fact that it celebrates independence from Great Britain, but kind of the meaning of it seems to be lost, they would ask Adams. And Adams was frustrated with that because he was frustrated by what passed for history of the founding movement at that time. The fact that people thought it was all kind of one big thing. They confused the war with the revolution. They thought it was the same thing. And then they confused both of those things with the Constitution and thought those were all part of the same set of historical circumstances, the same historical event even. And that frustrated him. I'm looking back on what had actually happened, trying to remember. And he remembered those things as being completely different, mostly related, but not necessarily related, not just one inevitable causal outcome of the other. It was the war for independence was an outcome of the broader revolution. The Constitution was a possible outcome of how the war for independence progressed and ended, but not even the most reliable one, not even the best one. And so he thought that people talking about it were doing a real disservice to what had happened between 1763 and 1790 by conflating all of those into one thing, assuming that they were part of the same group of ideas with the same actors, that the same issues were involved and all part of kind of the same unbroken string. And he thought that that was absurd, having lived through it. And in thinking about it, he wrote to Jefferson and asked him, he thought, well, am I remembering this right? And Jefferson responded, no, you're not remembering it. You're remembering it right. You're not remembering it wrong. That the history of the revolution is going to be forever forgotten. Nobody's going to be able to recover it based upon all of the things that have been lost about it, all of the things that have been twisted about it. And Adams built onto that, getting that back from Jefferson, that there will be no way that we can tell the history of the revolution or the Constitution because it's all been embedded in all of these other stories. So when I encountered that, and I kind of in trying to understand the American Revolution and the founding moment as this series of stories that Americans tell themselves about who they are and who they came to be, I found a lot of insight in that, and looked into what Adams then moved forward and kind of explaining what he thought all of those things had been, looking back on it as a historian in sort of Adams' perspective, and in seeing how the revolution, which, as he said, was what happened in the hearts and minds of Americans between 1763 and 1775, that ended before anyone fired a shot at the Lexington alarm at Lexington and Concord. And that process had to be ended, or had to have at least reached a level of maturity before anyone, in fact, decides to actively resist, before anyone engages in kind of military conflicts, before people put their lives on the line. And then how bewildered he was that people could, in fact, automatically associate that discussion about rights and liberties and the way that they are contested and the ways that they are compromised and the way that people are excluded and the way that people are included, that he was bewildered that people would automatically apply that to anything going on with even the Declaration of Independence and then the war. That's a way to kind of negotiate these ideas and negotiate this language. It's not the product of that language. It's not the product of those ideas. It's an iteration of it. And then the war itself is there to do, as Adams put it, it does what wars do. It's people shooting at each other to achieve essentially a political aim, rather than any kind of broader policy aim, rather than any kind of broader discussion about principles. It's people shooting at each other. And that just mainly involves the French. You get the French to fight your war, and then the French win your war, and that's the Revolutionary War. But the idea of conflating, and this is one of the great things that drove me a little crazy, but it came part of George Bancroft's great national narrative about American history, is that when we talk about the revolution, we're in Ken Burns' camp. We're talking about the war. You can have a multi-part series about the American Revolution and have most of it be about the war. You can have less than one episode be about what the people who lived through it said was the American Revolution. That would have made John Adams' head absolutely explode. And so when I think about the revolution, I do what I was taught in graduate school to do. When you've got questions that are unresolved, go to the people who lived through it and see what they said, and then try to understand what they meant. And I do that with Adams. In understanding that and then going back to to that part of the American Revolution, essentially the American inflection of the Enlightenment. And I think that that's a valuable way to look at it. As long as you're not excluding anybody from being in that, as long as you can understand that everybody can be involved in these ideas and relating to them, but they have to relate to them in different ways. And that's a much more interesting conversation to have about how the American experience is a kind of interprets those ideas for the kind of lived experience that's going on in the colonies in different ways for all kinds of people. So to me, that's the American Revolution. And then to see, as Adams explained it, the way that Great Britain was renegotiating the relationship between the colonies and Great Britain in terms of authority after the 7 Years' War because of the consequences of the war, because of the massive debt, because of the geopolitical problems with an enemy now, with actually now having borders, an enemy on all sides, that you then have to start putting boundaries on people, physical ones, legal ones, ideological ones, where they weren't boundaries before. And that's what makes people think about how their relationships are changing. To me, that's the most interesting part of it. And I think that's where all of the, in a sense, all the fun is, before it starts kind of getting pushed into these silos and starts being essentialized in ways that result in things like, the Declaration, or things like even the state constitutions of the first state constitutions that were written during independence, and then the way the war progresses and resolves into the state of affairs by 1783.
As you were talking, Tad, I reached over and grabbed my copy of Bernard Bailyn's The Ideological Origins of the American Revolution, because Bailyn, of course, starts with a quote from John Adams. What do we mean by the revolution, the war? That was no part of the revolution. It was only an effect and consequence of it. Are you working out of Bailyn's work? Where does Bailyn fit into this? Am I correct in, as you're speaking, reaching over to my copy of The Ideological Origins of the American Revolution? Or
no, I'm a Jack Green student. So I'm a Hopkins Jack Green student. I'm not a Harvard came for me later, but they are parallel tracks. Green and Bailyn operating, Jack operating in a more Atlantic context, Bernard Bailyn operating in a more American colonial British context, which is why Gordon Wood is a student of Bailyn. You can kind of you can take that strain. Bailyn hated Wood, ended up hating Wood because he thought radicalism was ideological origins, warmed over. And the two spoke rarely after publication of Radicalism because Bailyn just thought it was ideological origins. And there's something to that. I think that Bailyn, who I worked with a little bit, and the reason why we are kind of part of the same moment, even though I don't necessarily consider myself a follower of Bailyn's, is understanding that there is nothing that is inherently unique about the American condition, that it's not kind of sui generis part of an American production, that these are about influences that are coming from all kinds of places, and they're inflected in all of these ways. But it is that rich rights discussion that is what the crucial part of the American Revolution is. And I think that his notion about the way that he explains ideological origins is making sure that they are so deeply seated in not just the American experience, but in British history and in English history, that is a part of a broader vocabulary that's going on, that has a deep history that isn't just embedded. It's breaking away from this very isolated American history that only finds American origins, to those kind of things where you take it back to like Nathaniel Bacon or some foolishness like that. No, these are actually influences that are coming from all kinds of places that are being negotiated in an American context. And I think that's while Jack has a kind of different approach and Jack's students have a different approach to this, it's part of the same methodology.
Now, from there, I was particularly interested in moving to this point of discussion of a Patriot myth that emerged during World War II in the context of wartime propaganda. You say this myth fosters a static and monolithic view of the past, obstructing efforts to foster a more inclusive and accurate understanding of history. Aziz Rana, a law professor at Boston College, has described a constitutional creed that was also peddled by elites during the Cold War and reinforced through intense wartime propaganda. Your concerns definitely overlap, including myths can foster a sense of pride and belonging, but also perpetuate historical inaccuracies and biases, marginalizing alternative narratives and critical perspectives. What's the place of myths and creeds in American history? And perhaps you could also give us a little note on connecting how you view the Ken Burns documentary with the Patriot Myth, and how do you overcome these?
The role of myths. I get this question a lot because what I get asked is that I do a lot of breaking down the Patriot Myth, but what do you replace it with? Don't people need their myths? Don't nations need their myths? Isn't that an important sense of how we gain identity and meaning as a collective people? My initial response to that is not my job. That's somebody else's job. I'm here to try to get the pastorate and communicate that. The rest is kind of nationalism. But then again, when I have my more sober moments, I recognize that people kind of need that collective sense of identity. The problem with it is when it becomes nationalism. Patriotism is one thing, nationalism is another. And this has been the problem with the purposes to which the Patriot myth, American mythology has been deployed. It has been always deployed in the service of nationalism. The United States is the product of the moment of nationalism. And I don't think that you can understand the evolution of the nation state outside of the context of the rise of nationalism. This idea that the Americans as a people has to be inherently constructed in order to fit a new nation state, and therefore a people created to serve the nation state that's constructed. And so that is a part of the nationalist project, nationalism's project, as it's emerging in the late 18th century and early 19th century, which is why the first and probably last main great in terms of being largest, most impact, not necessarily the best, articulator of all that's George Bancroft. I mean, George Bancroft is literally a product of German Romantic nationalism. He is educated in Germany in the 18 teens and 1820s. He's literally a project of the beginnings of nationalism. And he takes German Romantic nationalism and the providential aspects of it, and he returns to the United States to apply all of that to United States history. And the result is his multi-volume articulation of that, which is the first articulation of God entering the chat, right? That God now has to be part of the American experience, has to be part of the identity of the American people. He's the one that first goes ahead and at least most powerfully connects the revolution to the war to the Constitution in one grand narrative arc, and then introduces the idea of manifest destiny as a part of the broader goal of a sovereign people. All of this nationalist foolishness. And so it's not just talking about how a people are good or even great. It's talking about how the American people are the best, are the greatest in a way that supports the nation state that emerged as a product of the Constitution, and that is the necessary distilled part of the Revolutionary War and the ideas of the American Revolution. All of that gets flattened into language that does nothing that only exists to serve the legitimation of those institutions as they existed. The Constitution, the Congress, the Supreme Court, the judiciary, the executives, as they evolved, as they had evolved by the 1820s and 1830s, including the abuse of authority included within it, that was the enslaver power. That you've got to legitimize all of that. You have to make it inevitable. That is the harm of the American mythology, and the role that it plays is establishing this very exclusionary American identity that has always centered American whiteness, that has always centered American elites, that has always centered Americans who are within positions of authority in the establishment. That those who are outside of that, and this is kind of where I focus my work right now, it's not really bottom up, it's certainly not top down, it's mostly outside in. I look at how power works, and people inside power and those outside power, and what that dynamic is like, especially when people inside power start to abuse it and people outside power do something about it. And looking at that, it is most of that American narrative, that American mythology has existed to support, legitimize the continuation of that power as it's structured, oppose any kind of main resistance to that power to change it. That's why it required a war to result in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and we haven't had anything structural like it since, except for maybe the 20th Amendment. And then what we have today, which is simply a continuation of that. So when you talk about what is the role of myth, there is sort of a general healthy place that a lot of myth and story has for creating identity in among nations. But when that mythology, when those stories are sharpened, when they're honed to simply be to serve the legitimacy of that particular nation state, when it becomes a tool of nationalism, then it becomes harmful, it becomes toxic. It militates against any potential for change by putting outside of the realm of possibility any kind of questioning of our constitutional foundations. And that is toxic, that is harmful. And so that's the role it plays. It's a product of the Patriots first, but it gets turbocharged by Bancroft. And then what happens, and that's the main narrative of U.S. history from the late 1820s through World War II, that even when academic history gets going in the late 1800s, when people start thinking about the revolution, they're not thinking about the war. They certainly don't confuse the two. This gets back to the conversation we were having before about there being this gap between what academic history does with the revolution and the war and the Constitution, and then what popular history does with it. So popular history continues with Bancroft through the 20th century, but academic history goes off into the progressive school, and it goes off into the imperial school, and there are these groups that are identifying different causes and different dynamics that lead to different ideas about the revolution. And people are really, not a whole lot of people who are talking about the war, actually. They're really focusing on it like Balin does, or like Jack does, or like John Adams did. They're focusing on those ideas. And then when you get to the war, what the Office of War Information has to do is that they have to identify, they have a problem that's being posed to them, which is that big groups of Americans don't want to mobilize for the war effort. They're running into a huge problem as the war gets going in 1942, where white Americans aren't necessarily jazzed about fighting Germany. There are too many people who think that, Europe needs to fight its own problems, and maybe the Germans aren't so bad. And then Black Americans are a huge problem because they're not inclined to go beyond the absolute minimum in order to support a country that isn't supporting them. And they have a lot of solidarity with what's going on with Asian Americans and what they're beginning to experience. And so but the United States government needs both of them to fight fascism. So what do? They want to create a sense of belonging, that you cut white Americans off from thinking that they have any allegiance to the Germans by redirecting all of that to constructing a reinforced American national identity that's focused on the founding. That all of Americans are, in fact, that the binary isn't about what's going on with Germany and that we need to stay apart from that. It's about freedom versus tyranny. Americans have always been for freedom. You are an American, you're for freedom. The Germans are for tyranny. The Americans are always against tyranny. The British were tyranny in the revolution. Then it's about freedom, Americans versus tyrannical British, and then, which gets complicated in terms of alliance with Britain, but we can talk about that. And then an easy kind of conversation with Germany. For Black Americans, it was a much tougher road to hoe. And so they couldn't succeed in that until they started deploying some Black storytellers, some Black filmmakers to articulate a story in which Black Americans have always been a part of American patriotism. This is actually where Ken Burns gets most of his stuff from, this kind of Benetton ad that is the American Revolution, this kaleidoscope of diversity that was the Continental Congress for some strange reason. And is getting a lot of that from a lot of this history that's kind of constructed in order to demonstrate to Black Americans that they have always been a part of that American project of freedom, that they're not in fact excluded from it, that they have a claim on it. And so this double V, victory at home, victory abroad, sort of theme that they developed. And then what they did was take both of those stories. They got a bunch of historians, including Arthur Schlesinger Jr., to work on this and to construct this. And then deployed it just massively through all kinds of media, from Frank Capra to Walt Disney, through radio. They censored 70% of all films produced from 1942 to early 1945 were censored by the Office of War Information to make sure they were being consistent with this American idea of patriotism and identity. 70% of all of them. This is a massive effort. But the problem is, and this sort of gets to the other point that was raised, the constitutional creed, is that it was supposed to end with the end of the war. And it didn't. As World War II turns into the Cold War, and as the Office of War Information is kind of demobbed, and all of the people and ideas are being subsumed into a Department of Defense, they see how effective it was, and they want to continue it. And so they just redirect it against communism and use it to explain America's new role as being best in the world, as being the leader of the new world order, and making that seem somehow natural and legitimized. So they take all of that, they pull on Bancroft, and they're able to kind of turbocharge that in just these extraordinary ways. But what happens, and this gets into the constitutional creed, is that the academics finally come along, and they create what we call the consensus school. And that's people like Daniel Boorstin and others, Lewis Hartz, who were largely went to school and kind of grew up during World War II, during this period. They take that to kind of create this idea of consensus that gets rid of the progressives, that gets rid of the imperial school, it gets rid of all of those, and comes up with this idea that, well, there is a unified American founding, that it was rights-based, that it was about liberty for all, and then all of the complications that historians had already started looking at just go out the window, because the broader project of American state building after World War II has to be served by the academy. And that is the one time in which academic history is allied with what the public's getting. And so academic history is then supported by the public, and what's going on at the public supporting what's going on in the academy. And that's true for almost 20 years. But by the time you get to the 1960s and a new generation of historians that are emerging and looking at more complicated ideas about civil rights and civil liberties and Black studies and women's studies and indigenous people, then they start to break that apart. And that's where academic history starts to diverge a lot more than through the public history. So the public history and the popular history stays in that space, whereas the academic history starts breaking apart and looking at it in all these different ways. And then you get to the neo-Whigs and the neo-progressives. You get to people like Wood and people like that. That's the part where that constitutional creed is created. It's created as a part of that consensus school. And all of those historians are part of that moment. And then a lot of people who we talk about today, like Ken Burns, like Steven Spielberg, that they are product of not only that popular history, but also that academic history that is just reinforcing this very narrow idea of what the founding was and about what America is, and this idea of American exceptionalism being on steroids through this, which is, again, this is deeply toxic, and it results in a popular culture that is so deeply divided from what academic historians now understand as being all of the dynamics of those founding moments. But then you've got academic historians just punt on that, and they race to popular history because they know it'll sell books, they know it'll sell movies. And so everybody's got their biography out there about the problematic George Washington. Great, but troubled. But he was great, but he was troubled. But he was great, but he was troubled. And everybody gets that treatment. Jefferson gets that treatment. The whole founding gets that treatment. Never anybody asking, what? Maybe the Constitution sucked. Maybe the anti-federalists were right. Maybe the people at the time who said that we could do better, we should at least try. James Madison, you're lying to think that there's Daniel Shays in everybody's backyard. There isn't. You can't prove it. But no, we can't even have that conversation. And so you're fighting against, that's the constitutional creed you're fighting against. It's an American civic religion. And all you get are apologetics from most people, always trying to explain it in ways that do nothing but reinforce it.
That the dichotomy, between freedom and tyranny, and the connection to, particularly the way we regularly criticize the undemocratic nature of the Constitution and its problems, also includes, that basically connecting that dichotomy and how it erases and completely throws out the window any kind of real discussion about the fact that suddenly after World War II, there's this credence emergence of, the U.S. is actually democratic. Where did that come from? When the entire history before, American people were very much aware it was not a democratic society or a democratic political system.
Yeah, when that's part of the war, right? You're right. There's no democratic language, but it's there in Bancroft, right? It's originally there in Bancroft, who is trying to explain. He's not at all trying to explain where the United States was in 1976. He's trying to explain where the United States is in 1836. With at least the language of democracy, even though it was no more a democracy then, but you're back into Jacksonian America, where there is this virtue in democratic language, where it's only It's mostly guys in clean white shirts who have powerful access, and so you include half a dozen guys in dirty white shirts. Congratulations, you're calling that a democracy. But is that language that Bancroft starts employing, which is why it just kind of stays there. And then you've got de Tocqueville and other people who are kind of celebrating the democratic nature of American society and using this language without really applying it in the kind of the broad political way that came to reality after the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. I mean, briefly before the Supreme Court guts all of that. But it's not but that language doesn't get really that boost until the war, because Americans have no idea of what a republic is anymore. They certainly don't have any idea. They believe in this thing called democracy. That's the language that it gets. So the idea of America not being democratic, regardless of the application, is alien to them. So to speak to them about their history, they have to speak to them in terms of what hasn't changed, of continuity. And that has to be, well, we're democratic now, therefore we must have been democratic then. Therefore, the revolution established a democratic society. Therefore, whatever language that Thomas Jefferson was using, he clearly meant a democracy. We're going to ignore everything they said about democracy being the enemy, and about democracy actually being what we're fighting against, and about democracy being the worst thing they could possibly think of, including monarchy. We're going to ignore all of that because they actually meant everybody. And you have to sort of pretend that none of that exists, that they were, in fact, proto-democrats. And modern folks, but again, like Ken Burns, but a lot of people, can't get away from that. That's where you get into this risible discussion about how is America a democracy or American a republic? FFS. What are you talking about? We need to talk about the essence of what a democracy is, and about what a republic is, and about how exclusionary these things are. But people are so confused about what the Constitution actually does, how it actually operates, that they actually think this is a democracy. And they think it's a functioning democracy. They think this is a robust democracy at the federal level. And they think the Constitution established that. And that's a part of the freedom language that we're with its democratic country. So you have to assume that A, it is in fact a democratic country, B, that it has delivered freedom, and C, that it has done both better than any place on earth. That's a tough discussion to have.
It sounds like your history is to present people with examples in which the Patriot myth has not been followed, and that has educational value in itself. To say, here are times when people have not gone along with this Patriot myth.
Well, it's one of the things that the book does, and that is rather different from a lot of the stuff that I've been doing through digital media and on Instagram and YouTube and TikTok and other places, and in my blog. That's kind of exploring the Patriot myth as being diagnostic of what are some of the interruption points that keep American resistance from forming, or at least forming effectively, to push back against the abusive authority of the Constitution, or any time in which the U.S. government has become abusive in its authority, abusing the consent of the governed for the interests of themselves or from a narrow group. And so what I looked at to try to identify a resistance history is go to the people who you were talking about before, is people who in fact at the time articulated against that throughout that the First Republic. But the book covers, the first chapter is on Bacon's Rebellion and Metacomet's War. But I have a whole chapter on the Bill of Rights as being a product of American resistance, and about the ratification process, and about how that goes through all of the points of resistance as a process, through articulating grievances through protest and organizing opposition in this very truncated way because of the ramrod strategy that Madison and Hamilton used to try to get the Constitution through. But the Bill of Rights is a product of resistance, and it's about following the critique of it in real time and trying to understand how the Anti-Federalists weren't able to get organized. And it's a criticism that's heaped upon them. Jill Lepore does it in her recent book, that, they were disorganized, that the Anti-Federalists didn't really stand for anything. And so that's why we can't identify what it is that they really argued against. Well, horseshit, Jill. It's just that they were run over by the Federalists so that they weren't able to organize effectively and for a couple of months, because Madison and Hamilton kept the whole damn thing secret. So by the time they actually saw the document and they were able to organize an opposition, they weren't clearly articulating anything until the Virginia Ratifying Convention. And that's where they started hitting on all cylinders. That's where you can find the articulation of that original critique of the Constitution that's absolutely nailing it. And had they been able to reach that point of organization and organized thought even 2 months earlier, it would have been a different ballgame with the outcome of the Constitution. There would have been forget about having the Bill of Rights added. There would have been a second constitutional convention. And so it's examining those moments in real time and taking those things seriously. The critiques of the Constitution as it operated in the first years of the early republic, particularly after the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 is passed. How that is the first articulation of all of this promise of the Constitution that it's eventually going to go ahead and serve rights. Well, apparently not. And how people are critiquing it at the moment, how they're resisting it at the moment. And then what the book, and this was not intended as a part of the book. It was in no way intended that it followed this. I thought that I was going to examine these moments of resistance as I saw it and be able to look at them on their own merits as kind of isolated incidents. But that's not how the book turned out. It turned out that all of these moments that I was looking at were related, and they were related to the opposition to the enslaver authority of the First Republic. And it's what connects them all. And it connects them all in ideas and people in that critique of the Constitution. And not necessarily, and this is not something that I explain very well in the book because it would take a bit of unpacking and maybe even a different book, that it's not necessarily just about slavery. Slavery is what unlocks the abusive authority of the First Republic. That if all republics in an Enlightenment moment, or in our post-Enlightenment moment, I guess, if we understand that all government is based upon the consent of the governed, then abusive authority is what governments do with that consent that doesn't serve the interests of the people. That's the compact, right? That's Locke. That's our basic understanding of how this is supposed to work. But when those with that authority abuse that authority by using that authority to serve other ends, to serve personal ends, to serve the ends of a narrow group, say, to protect the property interests and people of enslavers, and by rewarding that, by supporting that, by strengthening that with political power, and embedding that in a constitution that you make it difficult to change, except with amendment, and you built in the one thing that James Madison says is the innovation in authority that they develop, which is the Fugitive Slave Clause, actually going beyond what the British government ever did, to use the power of the federal government to protect that property interest. It's not necessarily a Marxist conversation, but we are talking about those core issues. They're using it to protect the property interest of a narrow few. This isn't about rights. This isn't about liberties. It's about wealth. It's about status. It's about power. And Madison admits that clearly, absolutely, in the Virginia Ratifying Convention in response to an attack from Patrick Henry. And so when you look at it like that and you see that that is the abusive authority that these folks are attacking, and it's based upon exploitation of other people in order to do that, and that's the authority that grows, it metastasizes over the course of the First Republic. By the time you get to Thoreau and writing Civil Disobedience in 1846, when the Mexican American War is fought to expand slavery, and their understanding of that, not a historian's understanding of it, Thoreau articulating that, his allies articulating that, and them finally coming to this point that they had not yet, when I say they, I mean establishment folks, I mean educated, white, comfortable people, are now reaching the point where they are recognizing that mythology about the Constitution that is already built up, that constitutional creed, that is in fact, that's a lie, that the Constitution is in fact to blame. And then what you have are people who are starting to articulate a different, when Bancroft and others are articulating that it's all, that the Constitution, that the Declaration, the war, the Constitution are all part of the same thing, you have people that are starting to disconnect them. You have Frederick Douglass is doing that. Thaddeus Stevens is doing that, and he does it clearly, and he does it well, who start to decouple them, saying that, hold on, the Declaration is actually only informs the Constitution. They're not part of the same thing. And you have Thaddeus Stevens articulating his idea that the Constitution exists only as a tool to implement the ideals of the Declaration as we interpret them. And so, to the extent that the Constitution is at all in conflict with those ideas, we must change it or abolish it or alter it. And that's where the disunionists start to come from. They're like, well, hold on. If the Madison rule that he articulated in the ratification process is that as great an evil as slavery is, creating the Union is a greater value and is more important. Even though that's kind of an abstraction, you've got to give a lot of value to what that union is for slavery, as great an evil as it is, to be less important than that. But that becomes built into American political culture. And that is what informs every compromise. It informs the Missouri Compromise of 1820. It informs the Fugitive Slave Clause, is that we can't do anything to destabilize slavery other than compromise with them, other than surrender to them, because it will destabilize the Union. And we can't be involved in a constitutional crisis like that because it would threaten the Union. Well, it's by the time you get to the 1840s and 1850s when people start looking at that and going, well, no, actually, we need to start taking this seriously, that the Constitution is the problem. And we need to decouple ourselves from this fundamental commitment that is, in fact, doing the work of the Declaration, that is doing the work of the Revolution. That it might be, in fact, the absolute problem. And it took people a long time to get to that point where they understood that disunion, that fighting against the Constitution, no union with slaveholders, that's not something that really shows up until the late 1840s, 1850s, fairly late in the game. So by the time you get to the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 and the Kansas-Nebraska Act and Charles Sumner being beaten to death, nearly to death on the floor of the Senate, and then people killing each other in Kansas over the question, that people start actually seeing the Constitution as the absolute bitter enemy. You have William Lloyd Garrison starting to burn copies of the Constitution, pointing to it as the fundamental problem and the enslaver power that has been done nothing but grow over the 80 years since ratification. And so it's that kind of conversation that I follow through the book. And that it was completely unintentional. It was following exactly those people you're talking about. It's that, okay, let's follow the critique. Let's follow the push. Let's follow what they saying is the abuse of authority and what they're doing about it, how they do it, what they think about it structurally, what they think about it in terms of constitutional transformation, what's needed to fix it. And then what is the response of authority to it? What is the backlash? What is the crackdown? What is actually the response to it in an unresponsive government? And that's one of the things that is very revealing. And I think about the periodization, right? I talk a lot about the First Republic, but I think that this is a useful way for us to understand constitutional evolution, that there is that pre-13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment Constitution that includes that enslaver power that is a fundamentally different place to live than it is after that. Even with the Supreme Court gutting it and Crookshank and the slaughterhouse cases and things like that, is that you have those amendments. It changes everything. That is a new country. That is a new republic. That is a new founding. I think that Eric Foner's right there. I think Manisha Sinha is right there. And then we can have I think an interesting discussion about how long that lasts. If there's a third republic that's created by the New Deal, by opening up more structural opportunities to people, that creates new relationships among people, has different kinds of questions about rights and about kind of social equality and social welfare and social democracy. But they're not structural changes constitutionally, so they can be rolled back as we see them all rolled back. And so that makes what might be the third republic, this kind of next expansion of those rights, something fundamentally different. We might be seeing right now the end of, I think we maybe already have seen the end of that republic with the destruction of that state, the destruction of the civil rights settlement that came out of the 60s and 70s, the destruction of women's rights, all of that rolled back into something, a fourth republic that might be closer to the first, especially depending upon what they do, what the court does with the 14th Amendment coming up. That's going to tell us everything.
I wanted to ask about what you wrote in 2024 about young people and as we're moving forward, and particularly me and Luke, the conversations we have, the interviews, but also just our thinking about the Constitution and what we want in the future. You wrote in June of 2024, you wrote an article titled "Why Young Americans Aren't Buying the Patriot Myth," and argued that younger Americans are less enamored with our history than their elders. Why is that the case? Why are we seeing this?
Well, I think that younger Americans, you guys show this all the time, right? You're asking different questions. and I get this a lot through my students, both graduate students and undergraduate students at Hopkins, that that what I find in the students that I taught 10 years ago, and I actually I don't remember whether I put this in the article. I think I did. The students I taught, 10 years ago, they might have been a bit cynical about the revolution and about the Constitution. But young people today are actively kind of distrustful of it, and that's different. That's different, and I think that can be productive because they're asking questions that I think a lot of young people were never asking. That they were assuming the same kind of value, unquestioning value in the Constitution. But I think that younger people today are seeing how it is in fact working out, particularly if you're growing up in a world in which Donald Trump has been a part of your political adult experience. That's a different way to see how the United States works and acts and is, and how our institutions work and act and don't. If that is your framework, then you are absolutely, then my experience with talking to lots of young people is that they don't even start at the point where they think that it's Star Spangled Great and that has to be deconstructed. They actually see what's rustling behind the curtain. And so they're actually wondering, none of this makes any sense. And so trying to explain how we got here is a different kind of conversation. And then the broader conversation that is, in fact, to me, the more valuable one, which is the kind of stuff that you guys talk about on this podcast all the time, which is we can do better. There are other options out there. There is nothing that chains us to this Constitution. But then you try to explain that, well, yeah, there is. Everybody thinks these guys are great. Everybody thinks we can't touch this. Well, why? Why can't we pass a constitutional amendment? Well, this is why. Well, why don't we directly elect the president? Well, this is why. And it makes no sense to anybody. And you know what? Frankly, that's healthy because it shouldn't make sense to anybody. It barely made sense in 1787. It sure as hell don't make any sense today. And then you get into this conversation with people. I was having this conversation actually, and I probably would have included this article had I had it before. I had a conversation with students the other day about women's rights, particularly women's right to choose, and they didn't understand why Congress didn't just put it in the Constitution, right? I mean, this is about women's rights. Women's rights are fundamental rights, right? I mean, you shouldn't be able to invade those rights. You don't even have to be quite so specific about abortion. You can, in fact, make it about women's rights and about the right to your own body and stuff, right? You can do that. That can be something that modern people can identify as being a fundamental human right, right? And then I had to explain to them now, nope, couldn't do it. Why? Because a distinct minority of the Congress can block it. And then even if it passed them, a distinct minority of the states could block that. Well, why? If a majority of the people want it, if a majority of Congress wants it, if a majority of the states want it, so a minority of both can actually stop any progress? Yep. Why? There was this guy named James Madison, and everybody thinks he was great. You get into that conversation, you're like, you can't, it's so interesting having that discussion because you can't go into the foundations of that inertia of American constitutional progress, that the impossibility of it, unless you go back to, well, why can't you change it? Well, James Madison can't change the Second Amendment, James Madison. Originalism, James Madison. It's absurd to people. And I think that's the same kind of perception that I think young people are bringing to it, which I think is actually a healthy perception. It can be hijacked by the wrong people for the wrong purposes, but I think that's what puts it on a more responsibility on people like you, who are doing all this communicating in really productive ways to make sure that you're doing it in broad ways that really reach them even more.
Thinking about a conversation with students in Denmark is interesting. That's an important thing to point out, that there are constitutional impediments, minoritarian impediments to realizing what most people want or to realizing progressive policies. There's a lot of discussion, I'm sure you know, on the left in the United States that puts forward a lot of things, especially a lot of the things that we see in many of the Scandinavian countries, for example, and doesn't have that conversation about how the political systems are different. I think it's so important to point out where the structural impediments exist in terms of unicameralism, bicameralism, equal suffrage, so on and so forth.
Yep. Yeah. Well, and even pluralism, right? I mean, these are important concepts. And I remember the last time that I taught undergraduates directly was it was a while ago, but I did a course because I mostly teach graduate students, and I've been like this for 10 years. And you get a little removed from where younger people are if you're only teaching graduate students. They have much different priorities. But so I love, like, every now and then going back to just teach undergraduates. So I'm teaching undergraduates again in the spring. But the last time I taught a course I created this course on American political development. So I wanted to go from, Bronze Age collapse in the Greeks up through now, talking about the development of Republican and democratic ideals and ideas and how all that develops. And so one of the projects that I had students do, because I love the comparative perspective, and I think that American students tend to learn a great deal when they learn about systems outside of the United States. Just as a matter of comparison, let's just do the work. So one of the projects that I have them do is that I break them into teams, and they each have to choose. We use the Economist ranking of classification of democracies, and they have to pick another country labeled as a democracy in whatever form that takes. And then they have to do a deep dive into that country and how it works and how it's democratic, how it functions, and then do a presentation on it. And then everybody has to vote on which country they would in fact want to live under, and include the United States from what we've learned throughout the whole class. And not once, in teaching the class 6 times, not once did any student choose the United States at the end. Not once. They almost always chose one of the Nordic countries. Switzerland is very popular, but they never once chose the United States. I thought that was fascinating.
I want to turn to Reconstruction. East Bay Democratic Socialists of America chapter here in Oakland, California, has a educational unit on Reconstruction. In suggesting a curriculum for folks, I thought of your video, the Radical Republicans, How Resistance Broke the Constitution. And I think you've made a lot of important points about Reconstruction. So it's a gigantic question, but how should we think about Reconstruction?
Well, I mean, I think that you need to think about that as the beginning of modern America. I think that you could actually dispose of the Revolution and the First Republic pretty easily. The way I think about it is that if you periodize it in the way that I think about it, but Eric Foner and Manish and people smarter than I have laid this out, that the Second Republic is really the founding of modern America in terms of a multiracial democracy. It establishes that, but it doesn't achieve it. And that's where Reconstruction becomes so valuable. You're able to actually see those forces of the First Republic that remain in place in American culture and American society, whether that's protecting property rights, whether that's protecting elites, whether that's protecting the establishment. They're all still there. You can abolish slavery, but that doesn't abolish inequality. That doesn't abolish racism. That doesn't abolish classism. It doesn't abolish any of these things. It abolishes the structural aspect of slavery. But then even all of those rights protections that are built into the 14th Amendment are gutted by the Supreme Court. They're all rolled back, even though the structure remains. So you change the structure of the Constitution, you built in a new structure, that structure remains, but it's hollowed out. And so looking at Reconstruction, what you're able to do is you're able to essentialize what the United States really is about at that time. Because to me, it's most valuable because the language actually means what it is that we think it means, rather than all of this freighting, which has to happen with the original Constitution. We have to change what they mean to actually change what the words they use to actually have different meanings for them to relate to people today in this kind of forced way, which is why everybody talks about them being proto-democrats, right? No. The people who are actually creating the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, you don't actually have to jerry-rig any of these things. You don't have to say that, well, they used this word, but they meant this thing. No, they said what they meant, and they used the rights of language that we use today. When they talk about the rights for Black people, they mean the rights for Black people, for crying out loud. I mean, when they say democracy, they mean democracy the way we mean democracy. And I think that also makes it more fundamental to our understanding of the modern United States. So you're able to see both the interests that are at work and always at work. So one of the points, I don't make it in the book, but frankly, I should make it somewhere. There's a wonderful scholar out of the University of Tübingen. Her name is Abby Heffer, and she does a lot of digital media work on authoritarianism. She's wonderful. And I've been talking to her a lot about authoritarianism and about the way it works in American history. And one of the things that she really helped me to realize is that when we talk about regime, what we really are talking about isn't just what's going on with Trump and the nationalist coalition that's keeping him in power. It's the recognition that he's actually not changing a whole lot. That is the establishment represented by Trump and those folks. In fact, all that different from the establishment that's been running through this in the United States history. Are the same people actually still in charge? Are we still just talking about essentially the Epstein class? Are we just talking about elite establishment white people that are running the show the whole time? And if that's in fact the regime, then we're able to see Reconstruction as being a way to take away some of the constitutional pillars of that regime's power in terms of the 3/5 clause and the Fugitive Slave Act, and it being a Dred Scott country at the time. That if you remove that, what remains? What remains are these social structures and these cultural structures. They remain in place. That nothing was done to destabilize them, and they remain in place today. So I think that you're able to see, because of the way it changes the constitutional structure and the political structure, you're able to see some continuity in terms of the social and cultural structure and the economic structure. But you're able to see that change in the political structure that makes it a little bit more, then you're able to sort of compare apples to apples, looking at Reconstruction and the way those forces work to actually draw a straight line to today. I don't think you can draw such a clear straight line through the First Republic because so much of that's changed. And I think that as a product of that resistance, but I think that the Reconstruction is so valuable because you can see all of those modern forces at work, and you can see them at work in recognizable ways.
The most visible resistance to Trump in 2025 was the No Kings protest. Luke has argued that while the spirit and energy of these protests are welcome, the official organizers' embrace of the Constitution is problematic. And that while the protests are directed at the imperial presidency as it exists in the Trump administration, it's not directed at the imperial presidency as such, which predates Trump, obviously, and also operates under Democratic administrations. We wanted to tie this in with your recent video, which argues Trump hasn't transformed the presidency. Why is that the case? And can we understand Trump as a product of the American constitutional system?
Well, it's an answer to the other question, too, is that Trump is absolutely the product of the American constitutional system in all kinds of ways. That not only is he operating like almost every other president has operated, that he is operating exactly in ways that the anti-federalists predicted. That he is exploiting all of the loopholes that have been there the entire time. That Donald Trump was inevitable. And the other bigger problem is that because he is taking advantage of all of these loopholes, we can go back to Arthur Schlesinger Jr. yet again. How many times has he come up twice in a podcast? I mean, he coined the term the imperial presidency. He wrote the book. I mean, coming out of the Nixon administration, his critique of Nixon was the imperial presidency, about how the Constitution enabled Richard Nixon. And that we need to have a closer look at the way the Constitution had evolved by then to make Richard Nixon possible. Donald Trump is the logical extension of Richard Nixon. He's a logical extent of using the imperial presidency in the ways in ways that are not in fact unconstitutional. He's not acting in unconstitutional ways. You might talk about the Emoluments Clause, but for the most part, he's not acting in ways that are unconstitutional. He's acting in ways that are immoral and that should be illegal. But he's not. You've seen other presidents who have gotten away with things. Now we're not. And I think my point is that he's not acting in things that are different in kind. He's just doing it in ways that are different in degree. George Washington ran roughshod over the rule of law in his White House because he did it against enslaved people nobody cares about. But that doesn't mean he didn't violate a law that he signed, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, to deploy the Department of Treasury agents to get back his personal property and own a judge. He used the Secretary of the Treasury to use his own staff to return his personal property. He then instructed Treasury agents in New Hampshire to violate the laws under the Fugitive Slave Act in order to kidnap, own a judge, and send her home without having to put her in front of a judge, which the law required. George Washington didn't care. The law didn't apply to him. What's the difference? These folks are people who don't think the law really applies to them because they are in this position of authority that they can go ahead and abuse it in ways not only were made possible by the constitutional structure, but that the original critics of the Constitution identified. They saw it. They articulated it. They argued against it. They said this is going to happen. Patrick Henry called it, this is a wink at monarchy. This is what's going to happen. But Madison has to stand up and say, no, we're going to have people with virtue in this office. Well, virtue, when you're talking about solidarity to their own community, to their own interests, and there always been solidarity to their own interests. When did they get impeached? Except for Andrew Johnson, for people who are acting in ways that are just outside of that authority. People are impeached for political reasons. Bill Clinton isn't impeached because he has a problem with Monica Lewinsky. He's impeached because the Republicans had something they could use against him. It was a political tool. It wasn't a moral tool, certainly not coming from them. So when you see about how the Constitution has been constructed, particularly as it involves the presidency, and again, Arthur Schlesinger Jr. just really nailed it. But he was one of the creators of the Patriot Myth. And he's one of the people who articulated the dangers of this myth when he was writing speeches for Kennedy. And then he was as clear a student of all that as there is. And so that book remains relevant now, as it did in 1974 when it was written. And it is that articulation that Donald Trump is the logical extension of Richard Nixon, because nothing put into place to actually rein any of that in. The pardon power, all of this garbage, nothing done. And I write in the book how this is Joe Biden's huge failure. It's a huge swing and a whiff after January 6th, 2021. That this is malpractice. You have this moment, and what happens? Liberal nationalism gets in the way. You think the Constitution is perfect, you can't change it. So what do? You fail to codify Roe. So what happens? Dobbs. I mean, you do all of it. You fail to act. And then what happens? The insurrectionist in chief gets elected, not a damn thing you can do about it, and has not done anything that is in large measure unconstitutional. So hell yeah, he's the same. And hell yeah, he's a product of the Constitution. And more to the point, damn it, Patrick Henry saw it coming. And that's what's got to gall you, right? You go back to the Virginia Ratifying Convention, and what's great is that you can read all of these debates. You can read them all. It's astonishingly well covered. It's a wonderful historical resource. And you read them and you can just tick off, yep, that happened. Yep, that happened. Yep, that happened. You don't even have to read anything but the Virginia Ratifying Convention. And you can see all of these things just popping up. But then you can also see other presidents kind of did this. So it's really mostly a product around the edges. Why? Because they enabled him to do that. And they knew it. And so that's the problem that we face. And nobody's going to do a damn thing about it. And so that's why in that video, it's a bigger warning, is that there is nothing right now that sees kind of the scale of how this president can abuse his authority without any meaningful changes to that authority. What are we going to do? We're going to continue to rely on virtue. That's it. So we just hope that Gavin Newsom is going to be better. That's it. That's the play. The play is, we're just going to elect somebody else who's more virtuous. That's the whole basis of the next election. We're not Donald Trump. We're more virtuous. You're going to base the future of the democracy on that, depending upon whether there is one. That's insane. Nobody is talking about structural change. Nobody. And I find that to be, this is getting us beside the point of your question. I know that, but I find that to be baffling. There's not a damn soul that's talking about structural change. I find that to be bewildering.
Is that a product of the myths that we've been talking about? Is that a failure of an alternative political leadership, a failure of the historians? There's perhaps no correct answer, but if you could say why.
Well, I think that there might not be a correct answer, but I think that we can at least start a valuable discussion about it because nobody's having the discussion. Because it's all of those things, right? It's certainly the absence of a clear of clear opposition leadership that can diagnose the problems and that can present possible solutions from it. Have you heard anybody come up with, here's the top 10 things I'm going to do if the Democrats win back the House? We're 11 months from the election. Here are the 10 things. Nope, nothing. Do you hear Gavin Newsom say, here's all the structural changes we need to make in order to not just stop these folks, but prevent it from happening again? Nah. Forget about policies. It's just we're not that guy, and let's put out some clever social media posts. So there isn't a clearly, even the most, I think the most effective, from my point of view, voices who are in Congress, like AOC, she's still operating within the structure. So she'll say the right things and try to do the right things, but it's always reinforcing the existing framework. She's not going to step outside the Democratic leadership. I hope she does. Maybe she does. Maybe that's coming. But she hasn't shown that yet. She's always reinforcing the party. Always. She'll come back to, I'm going to reinforce the party. Democratic Party's a big tent. And so you're not going to get that kind of language coming out of her. So if you don't have anybody out there actually saying, on the part of political opposition, that I've diagnosed the problems, and here's what we can do about them. And you know what? If we can't do that about them, we're going to damn well find a way to make it happen. Here you go. We're going to pitch this. We're going to talk a little bit more like Mamdani, right? We're going to pitch this as far as we can, and we're going to try to get there. You know what? We may not be able to get there, but I'm not going to pitch it halfway in hopes that we might get a quarter of the way. Let's pitch it as far as we can. So you need that kind of political leadership. And then you need kind of the chattering class, assholes like me, out there kind of talking about this stuff, saying about how it's possible. What is the history of it? What is the history of making it possible? What is not just a history? And this is where we get into what I write in the book are the interruption points to effective resistance. And the first one is cultural. It is this inertia we have built into us by this myth, by this constitutional creed, whatever name you want to call it, that makes Americans defer to the Constitution, to existing institutions. And so even having a conversation that brooks the topic of change, of fundamental change, of structural change, is seen as un-American, is seen as unpatriotic. Then you're a communist, damn it. Even if you are a communist, you still can't have the damn conversation. And so that's what you're up against. So you don't have historians that are giving it an honest, authentic history. You don't have opposition leaders that are articulating the possibility and diagnosing the problem and offering it as a solution. And then academics and others giving that some intellectual heft. And then you don't. And then what you also don't have is one of the bigger problems, which is why those other two things aren't happening. The bigger problem is cultural. We have this American inertia that makes it unpatriotic for you to even talk about that kind of change. And you're seen as a radical. Now, you're in the 1850s talking about that. You're not a radical. You're a freaking abolitionist. You're somebody who actually wants to free people. You're not a radical. Well, I guess you are a radical to some people then, but damn well doesn't. You might not be in terms of what's happening at the time that you need to change. So now the problem is it's deeply cultural, but you don't create that kind of cultural change unless you start the conversation and you keep having the conversation until you make it seem legitimate. And so that is a way of continuing kind of lay the groundwork for people talking about it and talking about it in realistic ways, not in kind of pie in the sky ways. Donald Trump, if Donald Trump might get impeached again, he'll never get removed. The Senate's not going to do that. This is ridiculous. But we can talk about what is possible. Let's talk about what a constitutional convention would look like. That's what the Anti-Federalists wanted in the first place. Let's talk about, in fact, what that would take. Let's talk about what structural change would, in fact, take. And if the answer to all those questions is, well, it's not possible. Why? Because minority rule is so embedded that it makes structural change impossible. that we only have to resort to still this forever incremental change or interpretive change. We just need a different set of 5 people in robes believing our version of the story for another 10 years before another group of 5 guys and judges, 5 guys or women and judges decide that their other version of the story happens. That's ridiculous. That's storytelling. That's stupid. But we need to then ask, that's kind of the critique that we need to push, is having people in authentic ways encounter that stopping point. Why is it ridiculous? Why is this change not possible? What does it come down to? Do we finally have to bury James Madison? And in order for that conversation to be a realistic one, to not be immediately dismissed as radical, as fringe, as unpatriotic. But we have to clearly diagnose that and talk about it. We have to make it legitimate by making it authentic, by making it real, by situating it in our real situation and what's really available to us, and then break down why that might be possible, why it might not be possible, and continue to have those conversations, realistic ones.
I really think it, for the most part, it comes down to like the political opposition. They don't really want to be in opposition. They don't want to be in opposition to the Constitution. They don't want any of this change. It keeps their power. The system works to their the way it is. Why would they change it? Why would they change it? And then, the chattering class, as you said, there's people like you, and then there's people that are just they're not going to stick their neck out. They're not going to say it straight in the face. This is what it is. This is what we're dealing with. And you can either look at it realistically and try to do something meaningful, or you can just carry on, as we have. That's how I look at it mostly.
Yeah, but you've got to start there, because you're absolutely right. This is the problem with looking at the establishment. They want to stay in the establishment. What makes them the establishment? The Constitution does. The last thing they're going to do is suggest any changes that provides them with their position. And the one thing that I learned 10 years of working in politics, particularly after I first got there working in the Senate, I worked on a campaign. She won. I went to the Senate with her. And we had all these great things. We were talking all these great progressive things we talked about doing, going to the Senate. But then I saw the change within 6 months. And then I saw it with every candidate I worked with and every office I worked with after that. Even first term people, the only thing they really want is the next term. They get there talking about change, and then all they want to do is stay. That's what you run into with every single one of them. So they're not going to say, they might talk resistance, but they will act and do establishment. Every single time. It never fails. I don't care whether it's Pritzker. I don't care who it is. They will talk a good game, but will they ever do anything to threaten not only their present position, but their chance at a future position within that establishment? Hell no. And so that's why you're not hearing anything coming from anybody within the establishment. So when people ask me, well, who are the leaders? Who are the resistance folks? People will always mention Bernie, or mention AOC. And I'm like, it ain't anybody who's currently in the establishment. You got to get out of that. You can't have a stake in it. Or at least you have to jettison your place you have to jettison that stake. You have to let go of it. For you to actually talk about what really needs change, because then all you'll do is perpetuate the same problems, because that's why there has been no democratic messaging. Do you remember back in, was it January? It was just a couple of weeks after the inauguration. Hakeem Jeffries came out with this idea that he was going to establish a democratic war room that was going to be a messaging team, a rapid response team that was going to dog this regime, this administration with everything they did. They were going to shadow them, and they were going to make their lives miserable and come up with a response to everything. And then nothing. And there's been nothing since. They don't have a message because they can't find something that will protect their positions, and be useful to them. So what they're going to do, they're going to do whatever they can to protect their positions. And that is the problem that we have. That is the main problem that we have. There can't be any proper opposition because all that air is being sucked out of the room by the establishment and the Democratic establishment, the party establishment, and all of their allies in the media and on digital media and everywhere else that have allegiance to them first and not to. It's why we have this talk about liberals versus progressives, right? And sort of this discourse online about that. And about the left, and about how all these words kind of get thrown around, and trying to talk to people about how well, the real question, I think, for most progressives is that what we have is a commitment to a series of values and a series of principles. And I'm not quite so sure that we care how we get there. I am not necessarily committed to this particular nation state as it is organized, this constitution, for getting us to achieve those values. If we can achieve those values with it, great. If we can't, great. But the idea is about achieving equality. The idea is about achieving justice. The idea is about achieving these goals, but not necessarily first saying, but only through this government. Well, I mean, if you're a progressive, you care about these issues. You care about the principles. You want to make sure that you try to achieve them. If the Democratic Party is in your way, then you can't necessarily just say, well, vote blue no matter who. Screw you. Then you clearly don't care any more about these issues than you say you do. If you're that, you're not going to talk about these issues. You're not going to talk about, you're not even going to talk about the possibility of universal health care, right? You live in a country like I do now, in which it's shockingly easy. Everything that they say about Denmark is true. This is a great place. It's insane how good it is in terms of healthcare and education, and it's got problems, but it's problems that you don't mind kind of choosing. You kind of figure out how to deal with it. And the fact that, even, my wife is like, well, why couldn't we do this in the United States? Well, this is why. And so anyway, it's a long-winded way of saying that there are people who are so attached to the establishment that it shows that they're less than committed to the values, they're less than committed to the principles, because they want their access to power, even if they don't have it, they want their access to that power protected. And that is where almost all resistance even fails to begin. That's where even all protest fails to begin. That's why when we get to the No Kings protest, it's great, it's valuable, it's necessary, it's an important first step in resistance. But if you have a No Kings movement that tells you what you can't say, that tells you that you can only protest between these hours and in these particular ways, and then you got to go home, and tells you what you can't say, that is what I would suggest be insufficient opposition.
This year, because we now are finally in 2026, this year is the 250th anniversary of the enactment, or the writing of the Declaration of Independence. It's also the 250th anniversary of Tom Paine's Common Sense, and we've actually talked with folks who are involved in a new 6-volume set of Paine's writings that will come out this year, Gary Burton and Gregory Clays. But we have these two monumental anniversaries. Paine's Common Sense, unfortunately, will get less attention than the Declaration of Independence, and more unfortunate, or equally unfortunate, the type of celebration I think that we'll see, the official celebration around the Declaration of Independence, will likely be one that brings out this Patriot myth that you've talked about. But all that to say, how should we be approaching these anniversaries? What can anniversaries and a 250th anniversary do in order to bring ideas to people? Personally, it's not so much the 250th anniversary that interests me. It's the opportunity to bring a discussion to people and put a particular spin on it. It's an opportunity creating moment, or excuse me, a conversation creating moment. How do you think about all this?
It exhausts me. That's how I think about it, all this. I knew that I had known it was coming up soon. And so it'll be in 8 days. January 10th is the anniversary of the publication of the first part of Common Sense in the Philadelphia Gazette. Just in 8 days. And that is, we could talk about that for a minute. I mean, that's what pushes people to independence. You've got to understand common sense, but common sense has nothing to do with the rest of the revolutionary movement. It's got a lot to do with Thomas Paine. But because Thomas Paine's able to articulate things that are able to connect with the people, and it's the people that actually are, this is one of the moments in which there is a push-up. This is a bottom-up movement. Independence is a bottom-up movement. Adams, Jefferson, they all admit that they're not talking about independence until early 1776. Jefferson puts it at late March, maybe April, after common sense really starts percolating. That's what Washington says, even though elites like Landon Carter says that common sense is nonsense, and they end up hating Paine. But anyway, the value in it, this one's going to be different. That if we were in what passes for normal times, then you're absolutely right that this would be an opportunity to draw attention to, even as counterpoint to these issues. It's an opportunity for discussion. People are looking at it. People are looking for content. And people's attention are kind of honed. And you can use, even if you're talking about, well, we're going to do a special thing on January 10th for the 250th anniversary of Thomas Paine's first emergence into American consciousness with common sense. Then people are able to sort of perk their ears up, and they're always valuable in that way. What makes this year different? And this year, there would always be. 1976 was this way. I mean, I was 5, but I remember it a bit. There will always be the happy patriotic horse crap that you get everywhere, because this is also a year for tourism, right? And when you have money that's involved in this kind of stuff, they're going to kind of chase the messaging to its lowest common denominator of rank patriotism. And that's what they're going to push. And Ken Burns will be there for them, and everybody else will be there for them. Heritage history will be alive and well this year, and just turbocharged by all of the money and attention that it's getting. You take that, and then you layer on what is going to be the absolute brutalization of history by this regime, and all of the money that it's going to put forward to use history to legitimize its current abuse of authority and to legitimize an expansion of it. I mean, that is going to be a layer of resources. We just look at it in mechanical ways. It's going to be a layer of resources put into that kind of distortion of American history, but it's propagandist use for political purposes in ways that we've never seen before from a historical perspective, from a historian's perspective. Maybe not since World War II and the Patriot Myth, but that's deployed for other purposes. But I don't think we've seen it that way since then. Not with the federal government behind using history for purely political messaging. So the challenge that you guys face, right, is how do you break through that? How do you break through that? It's we've already seen it, and that's a lot of money that has been. You take a look just at the money from the NEH, right? That's hundreds of millions of dollars that would have gone into at least some honest, authentic history programming to kind of tease out the kind of issues that we should be talking about. All of that money has been, so now not only are you not getting that, now all of that money is going to all of this conservative nationalist garbage. So that is another layer of meaning that's being assigned here and being deployed through all of these media outlets. So then the challenge becomes, okay, how can you navigate that to reach the audiences you need to reach with the messaging that you need to reach? So the counterpoint has to become even, more pointed. The counterpoint has to be more clear. So it's not just being responsive to that, because you can't just let it lay out there, but that will be an endless game of whack-a-mole that will exhaust you if you try to keep up with it. So is it about trying to identify your audiences and making sure you're expanding those audiences by keeping up with a drumbeat of counterpoint that is actually illustrating what this is also an anniversary of? And Thomas Paine is a great place to start. That you're picking out of what's going on in 1776 that is actually showing people everything else that's going on, so that conversation of independence is not simply wholly owned and deployed by this regime to serve their own ends. And I think that's the challenge that this year posts, is providing essentially counter programming and being intentional about that, understanding that, yeah, there are opportunities here, and that if you try to chase after bouncing off of what the regime is doing, you'll get exhausted quickly. When I think that it's better to kind of focus on your particular message about what's the authentic history that people need to know about, that they're not going to know about otherwise, and peg that to essentially an alternative 250th. And I guess that's all I'm really saying. There has to be an alternative 250th. There has to be a different conversation that's going on at a different level, and as coordinated as that can be between me and you and everybody else who's doing this work, as coordinated as that can be, that's got to kind of be I think that's got to kind of be the strategy. Rather than just let them go off what they're going to do. You can't counter that. But what you can do is focus on something that is honest and authentic, and that's serving the purpose with your audiences, and then trying to expand those audiences as much as possible. But first and foremost, being honest to the history and representing that history in a consistent and persistent way.
Wow. I just wanted to say thank you so much, Tad, for coming on here. This was like a terrific conversation.
You're very kind. No, I love what you guys do. I really do. I'm with you. I follow what you guys do, and I was thinking about this.
I was connected about TikTok so long ago. I remember.
I'm sorry?
I remembered originally,
Yeah.
original contact on TikTok, and I found you, and I was like, wow, look at this historian. Anyway, so I
Well, and
remember.
it's insane that since then I now have in the last year I have 100,000 on Instagram and I have 51,000 on YouTube, and I ain't doing a damn thing different on any of these things. And that's just in the last year alone. And it's just talking about this stuff. And I think that the kind of engagement you guys get, I think that you kind of see the questions, you kind of see the hunger that's out there for kind of an authentic engagement with this stuff. And I think that like there's this opportunity. My ego is not writing checks that my reality can't cash in this stuff. It's not about me. It's not because I'm so goddamn appealing. It's because people want this information. I think they want the engagement. They want this stuff. The number one thing that I get is that and you've seen this is well, I haven't heard that before. I didn't know that history. But I'm not Indiana Jones. I'm not like digging stuff out of the hidden past. This isn't crypto history, right? I mean, this is about just recovering. Even that language is crap, but is that it's about peeling back those layers that the mythology has concealed, but it's there. Again, I'm not inventing any of this stuff, and I think that's what surprises people. Somebody the other day, and I had to think about this for a bit. Somebody the other day called me the man in the high castle. And I had to think about that for a bit because do they mean the book or do they mean the series? These are different stories. But I'm pretty sure they meant the TV series, the Amazon series. And the idea that there's somebody out there with an alternative history and they're kind of feeding it as a form of opposition. You got to get out that this history didn't have to go this way. There's an alternative history that we could reach to if you just recognize what it is. And I think that is kind of what I do. So I guess I'll take it. But I'm not the only one who can do this. And when I was looking at the stuff that you guys do, and I was thinking that I'm not quite sure what I could add to your conversation. I agree with your stuff, so I'm not so sure that you could do this end of it. We're on the same side about all this stuff.
Not to open up, a whole other 15 minutes because I want to be aware of, your time. But it is also true that there are some people who know a lot of history and know a lot of things, but also think that there are other things more important to talk about. I've encountered, sections of the left, for example, that I'll just assume, know maybe a little bit more of the history that you present than the average person, but who don't think that there's really any use in talking about the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. What should the left really have to take from this? It's more about other struggles going on, or what even around Reconstruction. So I see it as a little bit of both. It's about education, certainly, and convincing the people who maybe know or are aware of a little bit more than average that these are the things, the struggle for universal and equal rights, that these are the things that matter.
Yeah. Well, it's not just that they matter, because you're absolutely right there. But I think that particularly with folks on the left, and I encounter those folks too. It's one thing to think about it substantively, but it's another thing if you convince them that they have to understand it tactically and they have to engage tactically, because this is the language of American political culture. And you have to work within this language if you're going to try to change anything within that culture. You're not dismantling the culture, not in one fell swoop. And so you can in fact move people, but first you kind of have to go to where they are, and that's where they are. That's where the language is. And so you can pull them along, but you have to first go and operate this. Get back to the very first part of this conversation. That's what I understood about public history, is that it looks different when you go to where the public is rather than where you are as a scholar. If you go to where they are, and then you start working back from there, then it looks different, it talks different, it acts different. And that's the same conversation that I have with folks on the left is that, yeah, you can disconnect yourself, but you're then disconnecting yourself from the opportunity to move people. And so even if you don't think substantively there's a relationship, there's a tactical purpose for understanding this and engaging it. I also happen to think there's a substantive purpose, but if you want to be really mercenary about it, you can put it in those terms, and it's effective.
And I think the history that you're tapping into of democratic struggles, the struggle for power that belongs to the majority of people, universal and equal rights, that's not an elitist history. That inherently can't be an elitist project, because
It's
democracy is
inherently an
not.
anti-establishment process.
Yeah.
It has to be,
Yeah.
because you always have to be critiquing it, right? You always have to be looking at it as you always. It's a point of skepticism, if not actual cynicism, and it is an anti. It is not an elitist project. It can't be, and still do it. If you're going to do it, then you're on the inside, and you're telling a different history. Then you're part of the nationalism. Then you're just telling an apologetic, self-referential, legitimizing story, rather than looking at it from the outside. It's the history of the struggle, but of a particular form.
All right. On that note, that's going to do it for us, the Democratic Constitution podcast. Thank you, Tad. Everybody have a good day.
It's my pleasure, friends. Bye bye.